This is the second installment of this three-webinar series, Nurturing Seeds of Peace, hosted by the International Dialogue Center and the Tannenbaum Center for Interreligious Understanding. Today, I'm going to be talking with Dicky Sofjan about how religious literacy can be practiced as a peace-building tool in context of conflict and division. Dicky, welcome to our conversation today. I'm really glad you're here. Can you say a little bit more about your work and maybe some examples of how you see religious literacy in action in your context to get us started?
Sure. My name is Dicky Sofjan. I'm from the Indonesian Consortium for Religious Studies, based in Universitas Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. So I've been a professor here in ICRS for close to 15 years now. So basically, I teach and do research on religion and contemporary issues. And I've been working on religious literacy since 2016, 2017, initially with the British Council and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in London, and also the British Council in Indonesia. But now we are closely working with the Mennonite Central Committee.
Wonderful. Can you give us a little bit more details about the work you do on a day-to-day basis and some ways that you've seen the impacts of religious literacy or the impacts of a lack of religious literacy in the work that you do?
As you know, I mean, Indonesia experienced what's called the Reformasi, or the Reform Movement, in 1997, 1998. And obviously that ushered in a whole new sort of ball game altogether. And so we had the democratization, we had media liberalization, and we also had decentralization and regional autonomy. And obviously with that, you had the explosion of participation, you had a lot of people coming together to associate themselves and to build movements and build organizations and so on and so forth. It also marked a sort of rise in religious movements as well, and the rise of many religious-based political parties. I mean, we saw at least 150 or so during the early days of Reformasi, new political parties, which many of them were very ethnocentric or religious based political parties.
And how does understanding religion play a role in having all of these different political parties and organizations arising kind of all around the same time? And how does that, what did people need, what do or did people need to know about religion in order to navigate this new landscape?
Right. The problem is, we were under a military autocratic regime for 32 years. And so a lot of the democratic and religious movements were pretty much constricted, and they were managed by the state. We had military, police intelligence looking over our shoulders, and so on and so forth. So that went on for close to 32 years. And obviously with Reformasi, there was this new realization and heightened awareness, and also this desire to participate in society, in politics, in business, in the civil sector, civil society sector, and so on and so forth. So what we saw was the coming out of many of these ethnic and also religious groups coming to the fore and building alliances and building power structures, both at the central level, but also at the sort of provincial, district, and local levels. And so what we saw was this mushrooming of many of these organizations, civil society NGOs, civil society organizations, and political parties, both at the national and local levels, sort of trying to aggregate the interest and bringing it to the fore and bringing it to the elections. But after a few elections, obviously, there was also this inertia, if you like, right? This sense that, why are we, required to participate in these recurring elections? And obviously now that we have direct elections for the president, for the governors, for the mayors, and even for village heads. And so you can just imagine the life of an Indonesian post-reform, that we are engaging in a lot of these elections, both at the national level, provincial, district level, mayority level, and also at the village level. And so obviously, you find a lot of people and organizations and movements falling off the cracks, right? And so many of them have become somewhat disillusioned by democracy and so on. And so there is that sort of sense of, disenchantment and a sense that they've been disenfranchised. And hence we saw right after Reformasi, even very quickly, a lot of friction, a lot of conflict, a lot of communal strife, and some of them have mostly occurred in, the far-flung provinces of Moluccas and also central Sulawesi. But obviously at that time, we also had secessionist movements in Aceh and also in Papua. And so, you get all of them mixed together in one country, and you can just imagine the challenge that the government and society have been confronting in terms of trying to come together as a nation. And so I think the religious literacy program sort of provides that and facilitates that coming together of people of different ethnicity, of different religions, to come together and to talk about essentially what they are facing in real time, in contemporary period. Because after all, I think one of the reflections that I got after experiencing and managing this program, I feel like all of the religious communities and faith communities are actually facing more or less the same kind of problems, related to perhaps political polarization, economic injustice, environmental injustice, polarization, and the sort of predatory nature of the social media. So the social media has become somewhat antisocial in many respects, and sort of dividing people and dividing communities into so many subgroups. And so I think from my assessment, the religious literacy program helps to get these faith communities from different parts of Indonesia to come together and to have meaningful discussions and conversations about the real issues.
I think that we often talk about religious literacy as this kind of add-on skill set that we need to, add to existing skills of civic engagement and other, ways of engaging with diversity. But, you're talking about in your context going from having a government that didn't allow any of that, and to all of a sudden then an entire population needing the skills to engage in democracy. And so that's a really big transition. And, religious literacy isn't just an add-on, it's an integral part of that. And so I think it's a different way of thinking about how religious literacy plays a role in these overall skills of being engaged as a citizen.
If I have to sort of describe religious literacy and the necessity for it, three things I would say, context, context, context. Yeah. So basically, religious literacy needs to be contextual. And in the case of Indonesia, for instance, for many decades, even since independence, we've experienced only what we call the mono-religious educational system, whereby Muslims only get to learn and study about Islam, Catholics about Catholicism, Protestants about Protestantism, Hindus about Hinduism, and so on and so forth. So there is no sort of effort and no sort of systematic way in which students and young people can actually learn and study other religions, because obviously the fear is this sort of unwarranted fear of religious dilution, that the students and young people will be somehow confused with their own religiosity and religious affiliations if they were to be forced to study about other religions, right? But we've seen other educational systems elsewhere whereby they introduce other religions into the classroom and into the fore, so that people have a much more sort of multi-religious perspective and understanding. And I guess, I mean, if you look at the theory about empathy, for instance, I mean, empathy can only come through multiple perspectives, right? So if we want our citizens to be emphatic and to be able to understand the sufferings of other people, then I think they need to have a more grounded sort of educational system whereby they would be exposed to other experiences of the religious others. And this is what we are lacking in our educational system.
When we were talking last week, you talked about the Ministry of Religious Affairs and these very almost siloed religious affairs officers who represent different religious traditions but don't necessarily collaborate with each other at the local level. Can you talk a little bit about how your work with those religious affairs officers has been transformative for some of these individuals?
Sure. So one of our main partners in our religious literacy program is with the Indonesian Ministry of Religious Affairs. And if you look it up, I mean, the Ministry of Religious Affairs is one of the most powerful institutions in Indonesia. And in terms of its national budget allocation, for instance, they are the fifth largest recipient of the national budget allocation, which amounts to around 75 trillion rupees, which is equivalent to about 4.8 billion US dollars. So it's quite a significant amount of money to spend for the governance of religion, throughout this vast archipelago. And so within the Ministry of Religious Affairs, they have this very unique collection of people whom they call the Penyuluh Agama, which essentially are religious extension officers. And they amount to around 67,000 across the vast archipelago. And so they operate at the sub-district level or kecamatan level. And many of them work in silos, simply because the budget allocation and the management of state funds is very linear, yeah? From the central ministry to the provinces, to the districts and mayoralties, and to the sub-districts. And so what happens as a consequence is that if they have a training or capacity development programs for their religious extension officers, the Muslims only get to meet the Muslims, and the Catholics only get to meet the Catholics. the Protestants, the Hindus, the Buddhists, the Confucianists. And so there's never any sort of opportunity or facilitation by the ministry to get them together to enhance their capacity, for instance, or to develop a more sort of sensitive ideas and notions about the development of the country and some of the trends in society and whatnot. And so I thought that was a problem when we first developed the religious literacy program. So my idea was to sort of break the mold and to break this siloization within the Ministry of Religious Affairs, so that the religious extension officers could meet, greet, and collaborate, hopefully in the future, and perhaps even share notes and experiences with respect to how they are managing their congregations, how they are managing the, the people who are under their wing, right? And so it was interesting that, when we held these religious literacy programs, that some of these people didn't realize that some of their friends were actually religious extension officers as well, and working in the same sub-district or working in the same district, and so on and so forth. And so I think one of the things that we did correctly was to break this siloization, so making them much more exposed to the kinds of experiences and issues that they were facing in society.
Some of the knowledge building that you have to do in that religious literacy work is not necessarily even about the religions, but just who is also a religious extension officer, like who else is in this same role. And so do you have any, I always love, stories and examples of, how this impacts at the personal level. Any examples of, interactions that you've seen between these individuals or communities as a result of this program?
Absolutely. So there are two types of training that we do. One is the sort of cascade workshops or training programs for the religious extension officers. But then we also have a higher level of training for the trainers. And so when it comes to the TOT, for instance, we would get the extension officers from the different provinces and districts to come to Yogyakarta to be trained for 5 days. And we deliberately sort of made it the policy to have them stay with people from other religions. So you would have in one hotel room, for instance, one Muslim religious extension officer and one Hindu perhaps, and one Catholic with one Confucianist, or one Protestant with the Buddhist, and so on and so forth. So, and they would be obviously having their own sort of conversation behind closed doors. But from what I have observed, for instance, in many of the coffee breaks and lunches and dinners, and even some of the sort of activities within the TOT, for instance, and also during the cascading workshop, there have been a lot of very basic questions. Like, you would have maybe a Catholic, for instance, extension officer would be asking a Confucianist, who is your God? What is the name of your God? Or maybe a Buddhist would ask, do Confucianists have a prophet, a messenger, for instance? Or a Muslim might ask a Catholic, in what way or how do you reconcile, your idea about Trinity and the one and only God, for instance. And so you get these kinds of interactions which would never have occurred within any of the training or programs held by the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And it's exactly these kinds of difficult conversations, I think, which would sort of elevate their thinking and appreciation for people from other faith communities. And if you get them to stick together long enough, the affective filters will come down and they will have much more, I think, understanding about the faith of their neighbors, of their colleagues, of their co-religionists, but also much more empathy and much more sort of mutual respect. One of the things that I also highlighted in the academic paper about the religious literacy was this idea about mutual learning platforms, right? So religious literacy programs can serve quite effectively as a mutual learning platform for the targeted individuals from the different faith communities to learn together, to be asking the taboo questions, the sensitive questions which you might otherwise not have posed because, there has never been any opportunity or chance for them to do so, right, in other settings. And so to me, religious literacy is learning about religions and learning about the religion of your friends, of your colleagues, of your neighbors. And also, while doing so, you enrich your own sort of understanding about your own tradition.
Yeah, it's one thing to read in a textbook or hear from a lecture, what the Catholic doctrine on the Trinity is. It's an entirely different thing to talk with somebody who is a devout Catholic and how they individually interpret that and wrestle with the Trinity and the you know uh, one true God. And so I think that this mutual learning platform approach to religious literacy is really valuable because it is religion only exists because of the people who continue to practice it, and so learning about religions from those people makes a lot of sense.
We have a module on the religious literacy, both for the actual workshop proper, but also for the training of trainers. So basically, it comprises a number of thematic sessions. So one is on religion and us. The second is on religion and the state. The third one is on religion and ecology, and then religion and human dignity. And the last one is religion and the internet. And we've added two more sessions, which include religion and human rights and religion and peace building. So the religion and the internet has always been from the very beginning part and parcel of the religious literacy program, which we've done, because we've also realized that a lot of these religious extension officers who also happen to be religious leaders in their own respective ways in their communities, in their sub-district levels or districts, or some of them are even relatively quite famous in their own sort of context and region. And so one of the things that we teach them is actually the skills and competency to be able to detect hoaxes. And so we do have some sort of skills building activities to be able to detect hoaxes. And then we've also taught them how to avoid spreading hate speeches, for instance. Yeah. And the latest one is actually on AI. So how do you detect real content from contents that are created and constructed by AI. Now, one of the interesting things about again, context in Indonesia, and I'm sure that this also is happening and occurring in many different countries and contexts, and that is you get these so-called celebrity preachers, yeah, or celebrity ustads, if you like, right? And so a lot of them have made themselves a name through social media, right? So they do a lot of these sermons, a lot of these preachings and religious messaging through social media, Facebook, YouTube, Reels, Instagram, and so on and so forth. And oftentimes these religious extension officers cannot compete with them in terms of both their savviness in the technical aspect of social media, but also in terms of their messaging. And so one of the things that we try to do is try to train them as well in terms of making digital contents. And this has been endorsed from the very beginning from the ministry. So the ministry is actually hoping that many of its religious extension officers could actually at least try to compete in terms of the production of social media contents that are aligned with religious moderation, aligned with the non-extreme interpretations of religion, for instance. And this has always been part and parcel of our religious literacy program from the very beginning.
This is a topic that I've been interested in for a while. I still have a friend, but we met in grad school who saw the gap in high quality religious studies content online and made an effort to compete with, again, some of those, celebrity religion personalities on YouTube and produce, actual scholarly videos. And so I think that approach is a really valuable one of, getting the voices with authority and actual training, and not just and the training in communication and in religious literacy, making those points, and maybe even doing some of that training through these online platforms that they're messaging on, so that the people that are watching them also recognize how to tell the difference between really sensationalist or fake social media about religion versus things that are, thoughtful and engaged and really concerned with religious literacy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the things about social media is the effectiveness and the efficiency and efficacy in terms of this process of massification, right? And so within this context of the culture of celebrity and culture of instantaneity, we are seeing this process of the massification of religious messages out there in social media. And as you noted correctly, that there's a lot of, sorry to say, very unsubstantiated, if not low level of quality in terms of the religious messages, right? And many of them are downright wrong and incorrect. But this whole idea about massification is also connected to what's called the dumbing down effect, right? Because if you're going to massify your messages, then you need to dumb down to a certain extent your message so that a lot of the people can understand. And if you were to just blurt out, scholarly analysis on religion or on theology, and obviously that would face, you'd be facing a brick wall essentially, because the masses would not be able to digest well enough. The netizens would not have even the time to digest some of these more sort of substantive messages or forms of knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an additional skill set to be able to translate some of these really complex issues in religion into, very accessible terms and communicate them in an accessible way without diluting the context and the complexity of it.
It's an art,
Yeah,
absolutely.
definitely. And I think that, I'm so happy to hear that, you've been including this, religion and the internet from the beginning of your program, because I think that we have to be aware that this is, the form of communication, and be actively working on it and not avoiding it.
There's a lot of issues and problems and challenges we face in terms of how to govern a religiously diverse society like Indonesia. People know Indonesia as, a Muslim populated country, one of the most populated Muslim countries. And now we have Pakistan, who supposedly has more Muslims quantitatively than Indonesia now, it is said. But not many people realize that in some provinces of Indonesia, especially in the eastern side of Indonesia, you have more Christians or more Catholics in many of these provinces, in many of these districts. So you do find that dynamic of sort of maybe dual or triple majority, dual or triple minority, meaning to say that at the national level, you might be a majority, but in certain provinces or district, you might be a minority, right? The same thing with the other religious communities. So I think there is that full realization on the part of the Indonesian nation and leaders that we have that problem, that we have those issues, and that we can't expect to have one theology, one religion that would supersede others. Yeah. So there is that idea about religious moderation or moderatism, however you might want to translate it. Yeah. But to me, religious moderation has its own sort of baggage. Yeah. Because, religion is also about passion. Religion is also about believing in the goodness of your own tradition, right? Meaning to say that if you believe in something good, then you want to fight for it, right? You want to strive for it, and you want to invite others to share the blessings, right? So, I mean, this is very natural in many religions, especially in Islam and Christianity, for instance, yeah? Maybe not so with other religions, yeah, especially Hinduism or Buddhism for that matter. But I think what's most important and the main distinction between religious moderation and religious literacy is that there is that aspiration to infuse critical thinking in religious literacy, and the idea to build that multiple perspective, with the hope that the participants will have develop empathy and develop mutual respect and appreciation for the religious others. And so these are some of the main sort of objectives of religious literacy, which I find are very different from the kind of state-sponsored religious moderation programs. Although, we have been working and we have been in conversations with people with the Ministry of Religious Affairs on these issues. But, with the new Minister of Religious Affairs now, for instance, he has underlined two major agendas. One is eco-theology, and the other one is on the curriculum of love. And so these are two very interesting and fascinating subject matters, I think, to be upheld by the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And so I think as much as people might have suspicious ideas about having a Ministry of Religious Affairs. But in the case of Indonesia, I can attest to the fact that a lot of the officers, a lot of the public officials in the Ministry of Religious Affairs are scholars, are people are learned people, people who are trained in religion, people who are ustads, people who are ustazah, people who are coming out from theology schools, and people who have done the masters and PhDs, both in Indonesia and overseas. And so there's a lot of desire for progress. There's a lot of desire for a much more vibrant religious celebration of diversity and so on and so forth. But, the state, as we know it, is always conservative, right? But it's only the academics and the NGO activists or religious preachers are usually the one more passionate and more sort of, gearing toward more progress.
That's a great answer. And to throw out those two new topics at the very end of our time of eco-theology and the curriculum of love, now I feel like we have another several hours worth of conversation that we could have. And the point you make about religious literacy including that critical thinking component, and from my perspective, becoming religiously literate doesn't have to mean dialing back your religious passion in any way, but it's also being able to apply critical thinking in your interactions with others and say, perhaps I have this religious passion, but I recognize that it's not the same as that, this other community or this other individual, and maybe we need to find ways to work together at times. So I
Right.
really appreciate that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and many of the things I discovered, for instance, during our training programs, there's also a lot of conversations about rituals and festivities, because there's a lot of ignorance, there's a lot of unawareness with respect to, what does this ritual actually mean for you? And so there's a lot of those kinds of questions coming in from people of other faith. And I think these are genuine questions in which these religious extension officers want to know, because oftentimes they get questions from their congregations, and if they don't know the answer, they can't just make it up, right? So the religious literacy program facilitates those kinds of learning so they can ask the other religious extension officers from the other religious traditions to sort of, come up with a smart response to some of these, questions and issues.
Yeah, I mean, when I've taught religion courses and religious literacy workshops, often what I want people to come away with is not all of the answers. No one is going to ever be able to answer every question about religion, but more the knowledge and skills for how to find those answers.
Exactly.
And evaluate the answers that they find with that critical perspective. And so, none of these religious affairs officers are going to be able to answer every last individual specific question, but if they can then go to their colleague from another religion or know which sources to point to, that's a much more valuable resource than I don't know, or making up an answer, which is never ideal.
Absolutely.
Are there a few kind of final words that you would want to leave us with, or a lesson that you hope that the participants in your training programs leave with if they forget everything 6 months later, like this is the core thing that they're holding on to?
as I'd mentioned, the first phase in our religious literacy program was supported by the British government through the FCDO and also the British Council. And for the second one, we are working closely with the Mennonite community in Indonesia. I myself am the founder and president of the Indonesian Foundation for Peace and Academic Partnership. And as you know, the Mennonites are very, their core business is peace building, right, and conflict resolution. And this was one of the reasons as well why we added on religion and peace building into our curriculum of the religious literacy program. So we try as much as possible to diversify our partners, and also to sort of expand the curriculum and expand the skill sets and competencies, because society is becoming much more complex and complicated nowadays. It's becoming much more polarized, although if you look at the data, Indonesia is not as polarized as the US, for instance, or the UK or Germany or France, for instance. But we do have our fault lines, religious fault lines within each of the religious communities, and also among the religious communities. And I sincerely hope that we can share the learnings that we've accumulated throughout these years on religious literacy. We've tried it with 7 to 8 country diplomats, So we had one religious literacy program with diplomats, with Indonesian diplomats, with Turkish, Russian, Suriname, Ecuadorian diplomats, and others. And we have always been now, since 3 years ago, been training Christian pastors from the Indonesian Western region on religious literacy. So I see that there is this revival of religious literacy in many parts of the world. We saw the rise of religious literacy in the G20 Interfaith Forum, and we are seeing that in many of the other international multilateral forum as well, highlighting the need for religious literacy. And I think the work of Erin, for instance, in global diplomacy also plays an important role in that. So I think I'm very hopeful that religious literacy will have more proponents in the future, and hopefully people would be able to appreciate more the benefits and the sort of the desire that we have for society, for the world through religious literacy.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm really inspired by the work that you're doing, and how you're working within your particular context to think about religious literacy and bring it to a particular population of these extension officers who then have another reach and can further bring religious literacy to communities and places where you might not be able to get your training, but they're going to be able to get access to. Thank you all for being here with us today. We have noted all of the questions in the chat, and they'll be really valuable as we think about future webinars.